This idea that somehow the negative gearing changes and the capital gains tax changes are going to make it much easier for young people to afford a house is frankly bunkum. This is at best a band-aid on a bullet wound, and I would say that this is much more likely to make a bad situation worse than better. Increasing taxes on things almost never increases the supply, and basically this is a tax on rental housing.
The Australian way of life is under threat like never before. Sectarian violence is rife on our streets. The political class is silencing mainstream Australians under the guise of hate speech. And the media, universities and major civic organisations continue to fan the flames of division. Australia is without leadership and Australians are losing hope. 2026 will be the year that defines the future of our great nation. Are we up to the task? Hello, Tony, and g'day to all of our viewers and listeners. Great to be back. Today, Tony will be sharing his thoughts on the federal budget and the budget in reply speeches, the meeting between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping, the Giggle and Tickle case, plus many other domestic issues. So, Tony, great to be back with you.
As always, Dan.
All right, well, let's start with the federal budget, which it would be fair to say has gone down like a lead balloon. The changes to negative gearing, capital gains tax, and how trusts are going to be treated was obviously a lie in terms of what they told the public before the election and what they've gone ahead and done now. It looks to me anyway like they're backpedaling pretty quickly. Albanese doesn't seem very enthusiastic in defending these changes, and he's got Jim Chalmers out there doing all the hard yards. So what's your assessment, Tony, of these changes and also the consequences to the government?
The bad news for the country from last week was that the Albanese government showed its true colours as a big government, big taxing, class envy, green leftist establishment. The good news for the country is that the Angus Taylor-led opposition, I think, has also shown its true colours as a strong and credible alternative. So what we saw last week in the budget was a government more interested in wealth redistribution, and what we saw with the budget reply was an alternative government more interested in wealth creation. So I think that in some respects the budget reply was even more significant than the budget itself, because it was a reply that was full of policy substance, policy bravery. And I think that the budget reply has well and truly established Angus Taylor as an extremely credible alternative Prime Minister. I think it's going to change the political dynamic very considerably. The government believed that having got away with misleading people over power prices, misleading people over its commitment to the Stage 3 tax cuts, it could get away with another breach of faith. But this is a rather different breach of faith in that you can't blame breaking a promise on tax on circumstances beyond your control. This was not a promise that was broken that involved any benefit to anyone. This was a pure and simple broken promise that involves more tax, not less, which puts into place bad policy, not good policy. And the final dimension to this, which I think is going to be a bit of a slow burn with the public, is that the taxes that he has drastically changed for the worse are taxes and so-called concessions that the Prime Minister himself has benefited from in the past. Now, if negative gearing was all right for him, why is it wrong for everyone else? If the capital gains tax discount was all right for him when he needed it, why is it wrong for everyone else? So not only is this a broken promise, not only is this bad policy, but it reeks of hypocrisy. And I think this is really going to be a huge difficulty for the government. I wouldn't be surprised if it's seen in the fullness of time as the moment when the Albanese government started to ebb out of office.
Why do you think they've gone ahead with this? I found it a bit strange because politically, you would say basically the government's got their foot on the neck of the coalition, never interrupt your opponent when they're when they're going backwards. They've now injected this into the political debate, which, as you say, has given Angus Taylor and the Liberal Party an opportunity to turn the tables on the government. To me, it seems like it was basically Jim Chalmers wanting to be able to at least be remembered for doing something in his time as Treasurer, and Albanese's basically let him do it because they've got a massive majority. As you sort of suggested, I don't think that they thought that the pushback would be this. I think they thought maybe it wouldn't be super popular, but it would just be a technical change to the tax system and people would live with it. But that doesn't appear to be the case.
Well, a government which says that this is a big deal can hardly then turn around and say after the event, actually, it's not such a big deal. I mean, for weeks beforehand, the government was flagging these changes and claiming that these were somehow very important reforms. The Prime Minister was standing up in the week before the budget saying, this is going to be a budget that's full of Labor values. Well, it turns out that the Labor values that the budget reflects are class envy, class war policy, broken promises, higher taxes, and the destruction of incentive and aspiration. I think they were a bit shocked by the savage reaction to the budget. I think they were surprised by the strength of Angus Taylor's policy response. And I do think that there was a kind of arrogance and complacency that was a product, first, of the very large parliamentary majority they've got, and second, of the fact that the opposition had a pretty bad year, certainly until Angus Taylor took over the leadership.
Do you think there is a case for property to be taxed differently than other investments? I mean, I think that there sometimes is a case because, unlike a share portfolio, I mean, you can't live in a share portfolio, but you can live in a house. Mm-hmm. And so I think that there is an issue with treating it conceptually the same as any other investment, because I don't think that housing, at least residential housing, is categorically the same as just another investment. Would you share that perspective?
My very strong instinct, I've got to say, Dan, is that assets are assets, income is income, and different classes of assets should not normally be treated differently, and different forms of income should not normally be treated differently. Now, I'm not saying that that's an absolute unbreakable rule, but if you look at the previous attempt by Paul Keating when he was Treasurer in the 80s to remove negative gearing from rental properties, to remove negative gearing from investment properties, it ended badly because, particularly in Sydney and Perth, rents skyrocketed and the availability of rental properties dramatically declined. This idea that somehow the negative gearing changes and the capital gains tax changes are going to make it much easier for young people to afford a house is frankly bunkum, absolute bunkum. And even on the government's own modelling, Treasury's own modelling, just 75,000 people over a decade are going to gain access to a home as a result of it. Now, 7,500 people a year, that's hardly going to make a difference. I mean, if housing affordability is a problem, and I accept that it is, this is at best a Band-Aid on a bullet wound, and I would say that this is much more likely to make a bad situation worse than better. Increasing taxes on things almost never increases the supply, and basically this is a tax on rental housing.
I think you put your finger on something important, which is, as you say, they try to big it up, saying this is going to be a big deal, and then their own budget papers say 75,000 more people over 10 years. And also I think Albanese had used the figure of house prices will continue to grow, but I think at 2% less per year. So instead of going up by 8% like it is in Perth, it would go by 6%. Well, okay, yes, technically your improving housing affordability compared to the counterfactual, but really how many more 25-year-olds are going to get into a property at 6% compared to 8% growth? I would say probably none. That does bring me to the big thing that they haven't talked about, which is mass migration. I mean, the single biggest driver on the demand side is mass migration of housing unaffordability. And on the supply side, it's the cost of actually building a house. If you're not bringing down the cost of building a house, if you're not bringing in more tradespeople or training more tradespeople to build them, really anything else you do is going to be very minor in the grand scheme of things.
Two things. First, Labor's pro-union changes are damaging productivity and driving up costs. And second, Labor's green obsessions are making it much harder to release more land for housing. And that is a much more important part of the problem than investors going into the market to buy properties that might, under different circumstances, be available to first home buyers. Now, I certainly think that we do need to make it easier for first home buyers. I think we need to make it easier for everyone. And the best way to make it easier for first home buyers is to have a more prosperous economy. And that means less tax, not more. It means less regulation, not more. It means less union power, not more. And again, I tend to think that everything this government is doing is making our prosperity more imperiled. And one of the reasons why I'm quite optimistic about the next election from the coalition's perspective is that I can't see any of the big problems that our country faces being improved by this government. And to get on to mass migration, well, obviously you're right, Dan. Record levels of immigration are obviously going to have a huge impact on housing costs. When we are importing close to 500,000 people a year, and we're lucky to build 100,000 new homes a year, obviously there's going to be massive pressure on supply, and there's going to be very significant price increases.
Well, in terms of Angus Taylor's budget and reply speech, there were, as you say, a number of policies outlined, including in relation to linking the immigration intake to house builds. Now, this to me makes sense at one level. Obviously, you need to take into account whether there's going to be houses here for newcomers to actually live in. I think that I would see that as a first step in a broader immigration policy, because it could be taken to imply if we build 500,000 homes, then we can have 500,000 new migrants. Now, I don't think that's what they're saying, but they are going to have to clarify what exactly they mean by the numbers. And I suspect they are going to have to put a number on the NOM, which should be much less than 100,000 in my view. But nonetheless, it is now finally integrating an economic side into the migration policy. Just as they've said they'll integrate a social component through the value statement, through the requirement to speak English, into the social side. So this seems to be a positive step, which I think needs to go much further, but a good step nonetheless.
I think that's right, Dan. These are very encouraging, important moves in the right direction. Angus has been saying since the beginning of migration that the numbers are too high and the quality is too low. He's been saying that we can and should discriminate on the basis of values. He's saying that we obviously need to take into account things like housing stock, employment prospects, and so on. And yes, plainly, there's going to have to be a lot more detail at some early point, well before the next election. But I do think, again, this is a clear case of the Liberal National Coalition now going very decisively in the right direction. I always think that you should start any policy discussion from first principles. Immigration has got to be run first and foremost for the benefit of the existing Australian population, not for the benefit of newcomers, although obviously they wouldn't come if they didn't think they were going to get a benefit, not to change Australia, but to help build up Australia. And frankly, the only people who should be coming to our country as a matter of course are people who are the genuine dependents of existing Australian citizens and people who we are confident are going to make a strong contribution to the country. And the best way of knowing that someone is likely to make a strong contribution to the country is if that person has a definite job offer at market wages plus, because obviously the best way to make a contribution to Australia from day one is to do a job that would not otherwise be done and pay taxes and contribute.
And the other major policy announcement was the indexation of the income tax thresholds. Now, this is a good idea because it would mean you have a permanent tax cut.
It's a discipline on government.
It's a discipline on government. And yes, having a one-off hit is nice, as what Albanese is offering. But with the indexation, you'll get a permanent long-term tax cut that will be baked into the system. So you'll be paying over the course of your working life a lot less tax than you would otherwise in the absence of that.
Exactly right. This is a discipline on government. That means that government cannot rely on inflation to automatically increase the tax take. It was put in place for a few years by the Fraser government. As the Fraser government lost discipline and lost direction, the change was reversed. I think that was a real pity, and good on Angus Taylor for having the courage and the principle to declare this policy early in his time as opposition leader, because let's face it, if you are going to be taken seriously, you can't just produce policies a few weeks out from an election. If you really believe them, if you really mean them, you will articulate them, defend them, explain them, justify them. And I think that this is going to really help sharpen the contrast between, on the one hand, the Albanese Labor government, which frankly is about wealth redistribution and the politics of envy and anxiety, and a Liberal National coalition, which should always be about aspiration, about opportunity, and about wealth creation.
Now, the other, budget in reply speech we should talk about is that of Senator Pauline Hanson, who delivered a speech from the Senate. And I thought there were a lot of good things in what Senator Hanson had to say as well, including, for example, the commitment to income tax splitting of families, which I think is also something that Senator Canavan has been a champion of over many years. And also something we talked about a fortnight ago, I think, which was ending taxpayer-funded welcome to country ceremonies, which I think would be a very good idea. But what I was quite buoyed by on Thursday night was putting the party politics to a side. If you take the policy substance of what Angus Taylor was saying, plus Senator Hanson, plus Matt Canavan, you take collectively the centre-right parties in Australia, we're sort of back in business. We're talking about the big ideas that really matter to Australia's future. And if you take those policies collectively, you say, yeah, if this was all implemented, Australia would be a much better country. And it's the first time I think I have felt that way in a number of years, where it's like, okay, we're finally getting somewhere. The abolition of net zero is another policy that is now completely accepted on the centre right. So I felt positive about that general direction.
And I think a lot of people did, Dan. I had a lot of text messages on Thursday night and Friday from people saying it's at least a decade since they've been as positive about the coalition as they felt listening to Angus Taylor's speech. I think many of us for a long time, a depressingly long time, have felt that the best thing you could say about the coalition is that it wasn't as bad as Labor. But I think now we've got a choice between a Labor Party, which is definitely on the wrong track, and a Liberal National coalition, which is definitely on the right track. It's not just choosing the lesser evil, as it were. It's now offering us a positive good on the ballot paper.
Hi, thanks for watching. Did you know that 3/4 of you watching this podcast aren't currently subscribed to the IPA's YouTube channel? So do us a favour, hit subscribe and you won't miss any of the action. While you're at it, head to ipa.org.au, follow the prompts to subscribe to the IPA's website So that way you will find all of our research and analysis. Now back to the chat. All right, well, let's talk about another issue on the domestic scene, which is the Giggle versus Tickle court case. Now that was a court case. It's now a judgment that's come out in the negative. So basically, Giggle is a platform that was intended for women only to be able to be used. That was challenged by an individual, a trans individual, who said it was discriminatory to be undertaking that action to not allow them on the platform. And then it went through the court system. There was a ruling in the federal court that, in fact, you cannot, quote unquote, discriminate on that basis. Now, Sal Grover, who ran the platform, has said, well, she's going to go to the High Court. So good on her for doing that. But this does seem that even though the public is looking at this saying, how is it the case that we can't simply recognise men are men and women are women? It still seems to be the case that the political system and the legal system has not caught up with normal public opinion at the moment.
Well, I think it's the case, Dan, that the political system and the legal system has drastically departed from common sense and what would normally be regarded as the ordinary thinking of humanity. Certainly has always been the standard thinking of humanity since time immemorial. The really interesting feature of the immediate reaction to this federal court decision was, again, Angus Taylor's swift announcement that he deeply disagreed with it and that a coalition government would change the law to make it absolutely crystal clear that women had the right to enjoy their own spaces and that women-only spaces could not be invaded by men who say they're women. Now, again, we say that this is just common sense, but the federal court found that the legislation as it was amended by the Gillard government back in 2013 effectively says that gender is a fluid concept. Gender is simply what an individual decides it to be. Now, if that is in fact, as the court has found, the impact of the legislation as it stands, well, that legislation has got to be changed as quickly as possible.
I think it's interesting as well because at the time that legislation went through, if you were to say to people, this legislation is really bad because it's going to mean that men basically are able to go into female spaces and there's not really much that can be done about it, a lot of people would have said you're crazy for saying that. And it's the same I was thinking about other legislation that gets put in and then there's no real meaningful impact on people's day-to-day lives for a number of years. What happens is the activists are able to get a hold of this legislation. And that's why I'm always very, very conservative with any legislation that's passed that has sweeping powers or changes to definitions, because at a minimum, you are inviting a whole lot of uncertainty into our legal system. And it's almost always going to be the case that you have a small number of, well-funded activist groups that will weaponize it in a way that's consistent with their ideology. We've seen it with green groups using the lawfare system to shut down coal projects, which it was never intended to do. So I think this is a really good example of why when we talk about limited government, this is actually why we want to have a limited government to reduce the risk that it introduces into our lives.
You're right, Dan, and certainly if you go back and look at the speeches that were given at the time in the Parliament, there was no awareness by any of the speakers, certainly in the speeches that I've reread over the last week or so, there was no awareness by any of the speakers that they were opening this Pandora's box. There was some concerns, which the opposition expressed at the time, about the amendments to the legislation making it more difficult for religious institutions to maintain their values and their standards. But anyone who'd said that this would essentially mean that gender was just what you said it was and that men could say they were women and women could say they were men and no one could argue the toss, you would have been accused of the slippery slope argument. Yep. And dismissed. But that's exactly what we've found ourselves on. Exactly what we've found ourselves on. No sooner had the subsequent gay marriage debate been decided one way in favour of same-sex marriage, we then had the trans push really get up ahead of steam. And subsequently, it's been taken to what I think are absurd lengths.
Yeah. All right, well, let's go to the international front. And I think the main development, obviously, we've got the Iran conflict, which is ongoing.
Mm-hmm.
We've also had the meeting with President Trump and Xi Jinping of China. It seemed on the face of it a very convivial meeting, if you like, as these are often presented to the outside world. Now, what they talked about in private, I don't know. Do you have any sense of what was really going on with this meeting? I mean, they always say it's about cooperation and economic development and et cetera, et cetera. Now, I suspect there's many other things involved here. What's your read on the meeting and what came out of it?
Look, I think it was a PR exercise, essentially. There's often a lot to be said for PR exercises. And given the comparative rarity of summit meetings between the leaders of the two most powerful countries in the world, it's probably no bad thing that it happened. But I don't believe, on what we've been told, there have been any substantive outcomes. I don't think China has given up its dreams of global domination. I don't think China has surrendered its technological arms race with the United States, or indeed its actual arms race with the United States. My big fear was that the president might end up making some concession over Taiwan. That doesn't appear to have happened, and yet the mere fact that he gave the Chinese leadership a chance to bluster, as they always do on Taiwan, to put in flashing neon lights, their over-the-top claims to some kind of a right to Taiwan, I thought, well, I didn't particularly like seeing it, I've got to say. I mean, the big issue at the moment is, will America finish the job in Iran? That's the big issue. Now, can we restore freedom of navigation in the Persian Gulf? Can we effectively reopen the Straits of Hormuz without bringing about regime change in Tehran? That's the big question. Now, I think the minimum objective for the global West, if you like, the Democratic Alliance, the minimum objective has got to be the total degradation of the Iranian war machine, which, as we have seen, is a threat to the region as well as to Israel and ultimately to the wider world. The degradation of the Iranian war machine and the restoration of freedom of navigation in the Gulf. Now, I don't believe that either of those objectives will be achieved without regime change as well. We certainly can't have a situation where the Iranian theocracy is charging what is effectively a massive toll on all ships going through the Straits of Hormuz. That would be a long-term strategic disaster, and that would be a terrible defeat for the United States and ultimately an utter humiliation for President Trump.
Well, you had a lot of dealings with China as Prime Minister, and based on your insights and perspectives of what you will have picked up from your time, are there any sort of broader implications for Australia at the moment as it pertains to that meeting? Obviously, Taiwan is the big issue, but is there anything Australia should be aware of at the moment, or is it sort of business as usual?
I think what's absolutely palpable is that China will do no more and no less than it is in China's interests to do. And China's values, at least while the CCP is in charge, are very, very different from ours. If President Trump was going to Beijing in the hope and expectation that Beijing would somehow help him to restore freedom of navigation in the Persian Gulf, I think he was utterly mistaken. From what we can gather, most of the ships that are transiting through the Gulf at the moment are Chinese ships. And because there is an effective de facto alliance between the Iranian theocracy and the communist dictatorship in Beijing, of course the Iranians are going to give favoured treatment to their friends. Now, I think the tragedy of all of this, the humiliation of all of this, the shame of all this from Australia's perspective is that what the Americans are trying to do is fundamentally right, and we're hardly lifting a finger to help other than in an empty rhetorical way. Now, that's bad for us, I think, but I guess it's an even greater shame and humiliation for what we used to think of as much more powerful and influential countries like Britain and France, that they are not providing any effective help to the Americans. And in fact, they're saying that while they want to secure freedom of navigation, they're not going to lift a finger to enforce it while there are hostilities. Well, if someone is determined to deny something to you, you either accept that denial or you are prepared to assert, with force if necessary, you're right. And we all have an absolute right to freedom of navigation in the Persian Gulf.
All right, Tony, on that note, I think we'll leave it there. So thanks as always for your insights, and we'll catch up again shortly.
I look forward to it, Dan.
This is a production of the Centre for the Australian Way of Life at the Institute of Public Affairs. To find out more, visit australia.ipa.org.au.